When you're working with and prescribing clients there, how are you prescribing the effort you're trying to see on any given day?
If someone is training for an event and we know kind of race paces, I may also prescribe based off of race pace. So like I want 10 by 800 at 5K race pace, adjust up or down from there to reach RPE 8 by the end of the workout. So that might be how I prescribe a high intensity session.
And so Alec, I was looking up some stuff, and talk to me about the quote unquote world record for Murph. I just want to start there because I think that a lot of our listeners are familiar with what Murph is, which is, obviously you're hitting runs, you're hitting body weight. Did you do it with a vest? Did you separate it out? Like, how do you set the quote unquote world record for Murph? Talk to me about that, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure your CrossFit audience will be interested in this. So I have, I guess, the unofficial record, like it's not a Guinness record or anything, right? But fastest known time for the weighted and unpartitioned format. So with a 20-pound vest and not breaking up the reps at all. So it's the mile run right into the 100 pull-ups, get all the pull-ups done before all 200 push-ups, then all 300 squats in that second mile run. I first found out about the kind of record category or like fastest known time for it when an old buddy of mine, Hunter McIntyre, set it in like 2020, I think it was. And I saw he did a big video on it, did it for charity, and he did it in like 34 minutes, weighted and unpartitioned. And so I came across that video the next year on Memorial Day. I'm like, okay, I've raced with Hunter before. I've been close enough to him in times. I'm just going to kind of copy his strategy and like, see how fast I can do it. But I had no intentions of setting the record. And so on Memorial Day, I think 2021, it was just at my gym, with the crew, did it and ended up coming in underneath his record time. And was like, wow, I had no idea that I'd be able to do that. But it wasn't recorded. It wasn't legit. So I called up a friend of mine who has like a media outlet, YouTube channel, all that kind of stuff for fitness. And like, hey, I want to organize an unofficial record attempt. So we did a live stream. I got some judges, got the video and everything, and then did it again a couple weeks later and did it in 32:41.
32?
So it took about, yeah.
Fuck. Dude, that's so fast. For anybody listening, I mean, who have not done Murph, most people break up Murph in a variety of ways. One way is like they segment into 10 rounds of like of 10, 20, 30, right? Another way is they can break up into 5 rounds, but going straight through is so difficult, especially with the vest on, because you just get burned out, man. So that's an incredible time. What were your miles? Like sub 6s?
First one was a little bit under 6. And then the last one, I was pretty deep in the pain cave coming off the squats. I think it was closer to 7. Wow. But what I learned watching Hunter's video, I learned a lot just kind of watching what he did. I think that he ran too hard because I just saw the fatigue like immediately, going into those pull-ups. I saw him really start to fizzle out. And I know the capacity that he has. He's an insane runner. And I was like, if running a 5:30 kind of gassed him out, I probably shouldn't do it either kind of thing. So I went a little bit slower. I actually ran slower than Hunter. And I think that gave me just a lot more energy to push the reps a little bit faster. I ripped the squats super fast and, my legs, I had a hard time getting my legs back underneath me for that second run, but I think it was worth it, to be able to get through those reps so much faster. I fell apart a little bit at the end, but overall it came out okay.
Man, pacing's everything. Well, Alec, man, I'm super excited to talk to you. Usually Jason picks a lot of the guests for the show, but I was like, dude, we have to have Alec on. I stumbled on your page, man, because I've gotten super into running and this whole like hybrid athlete world. And you're obviously very big in that world. And that's a lot of what I want to talk to you about. I come from this background, which I kick myself in the butt all the time now I was a collegiate swimmer. I did triathlons afterwards, but like I was always told that like, hey, if you want to be really good at the endurance stuff, just can't lift weights, like that's going to be counterintuitive to everything you're doing. It's not going to help. And then when I found CrossFit and found that stuff, then it was the opposite. It was, you really can't run or do the endurance stuff anymore if you want to get strong. And being, coming from an endurance background, strength was always my weakness. It was like the one thing I had to get better. And so I bought that, hook, line, and sinker. And it was a bummer for a while because I kind of like left the original sport that I really loved, which was endurance stuff. But recently with like, and that's kind of the first thing I want to talk to you about, like the resurgence and why, hybrid training has gained so much momentum, why so many people are looking to do this type of training. But that really kind of like opened my eyes to the fact that, hey, there is a way to do both. There are, maybe not direct benefits of doing one for the other, but there's definitely a bunch of indirect benefits to it. And there's a way where you can have both. So that's why I was really excited to talk to you. First question I kind of wanted to open up with is, you've been doing this stuff for a while. So maybe you can give us a quick background of just how you got into like endurance running first, and then how that turned into getting super into lifting, and then how that turned into doing both. And then I'd love to hear kind of your opinion on why you think that this is seen such a momentum shift now specifically, and why so many people are gravitating towards, hybrid training. And then we can even discuss maybe what that even means.
Yeah. So to get a little bit more into my background, in like high school and college and that kind of thing, I did a variety of sports. I would say I had a kind of natural talent for a lot of them, but was not amazing at any individual sport. I did track and field, I did cross country, I did tennis, I did baseball, and I was pretty good at most of those things. But again, I was not like a standout or all-star at any of those things. But I just kind of loved doing it all. I even did football, which is probably one of my worst sports, but I liked lifting weights with the team and, do a little bit of everything. Didn't want to give any of it up. And I kind of stumbled upon, during an off season, something called Spartan Race, which is obstacle course racing. Just signed up. It looked like a fun thing to do. And suddenly all of the skills that I'd been developing across a wide range of sports, from, running to weightlifting with the football team to wrestling, it all kind of came together in that first obstacle course race, and I crushed it and had more fun than I've ever had in my life doing anything. I was like, this is awesome. So I signed up, did more of those, kept kind of making the podium, performing really well. And eventually Spartan Race signed me to their pro team. So I got to travel around the country and do dozens. I think I did like 100 of those races. I stopped keeping track, but did a lot of Spartan races. So that's kind of how I got into the hybrid niche. And when I started doing those competitively, I started thinking less about, training for cross country or training for wrestling. And I started thinking about, okay, how can I take strength training and endurance training and mobility training and athletic training? How can I combine all of these things together to be really good at the sport of OCR? And this was, almost probably 10 years ago. So that's how I really got into it. And from there, my niche kind of grew. I started coaching a lot of like military athletes and people like that, and just getting exposed to a lot of different types of hybrid training. It's a very broad thing, right? There's no precise definition of what hybrid training is. So I started talking with people who wanted to, do a powerlifting competition and train for a 50-mile ultra and all this stuff. So I had to really learn how to combine strength and endurance in a way that's going to minimize that interference, maximize recovery, and allow you to be good at a ton of different things and in a way that not a lot of people had been doing. But I've seen it definitely gain popularity, I think in large part just because of a lot of CrossFitters and obstacle course athletes and Hyrox athletes who are pushing the limits in ways that are pretty new, and just getting people really excited about it. And I think in the social media age, it's just easier to share some of those cool niches that probably, flew under the radar before. But now just being able to put yourself out there more and be like, hey, look at this crazy event called Hyrox or Spartan or whatever. It's just easier for those kinds of cool, like niche athletic pursuits to gain some traction. And I'm really excited about it. I love to see it.
I do think we have to define like what is hybrid training, or at least like hone in on it. And you kind of alluded to it, Alec, by saying like, hey, someone who wants to get ready for a powerlifting competition and also run a half marathon, for example. Okay, I can start wrapping my head around those two people, or the person who wants both. But like, I think what CrossFit did for the industry, I personally think it revolutionized the idea of effort and intensity. And I think that that's carrying over into these hybrid training modalities. Like, meaning like if all you do is went into the gym and, did a little bit of this, a little bit of that, did a little bit of running, a little bit of this, I don't think you'd ever get close to the capacity built by these CrossFit athletes and I think that mindset, I believe, has now evolved because of, to your point, Alec, like the training age, because I've kind of seen that in myself, but it still takes like this effort. You guys get what I'm saying? Like, I think what CrossFit did more than anything is they added a clock and an effort to all these things. And then when you talk about Metcons, I think the skill component, I think, could be separate. I think that's more sport specific. But I think what it did is it started alluding to, hey, if you bust your ass, you create adaptation. So that's kind of what I think CrossFit has really done for the industry really well. And I think it's carried over into hybrid training.
Yeah. And to your point too, I think that a lot of people who are really intense about CrossFit and get really good at it, I know CrossFitters who are training, several hours a day, and they might do multiple Metcons and that kind of stuff. But if you're like, hey, I'm going to work out 3 days a week for 60 to 90 minutes, and I want to maximize muscle mass, aerobic fitness, all those sorts of things, then I'm like, all right, maybe we should get a little bit of like pure cardio work, like give me a couple 800-meter intervals or something like that. I think that works really well for someone who maybe they don't have all the time in the world. Whereas if you're training like, 2-3 hours a day and you're able to handle that, eating enough food and et cetera, you're going to get a ton of results just from the collective effort of all of that training. Whereas for the general population person who's doing a little bit less and they're like, I have 2-3 hours a week and I want to be able to run a 10K. It's like, all right, let's get a little pure cardio in there. Whereas for someone like you, Jason, I could see why you're like, nah, I probably don't need to do a lot of straight cardio work just because you have all of that training volume, all of that effort, accumulating throughout the week.
Yeah, no need to run ever again after I just did my Hyrox with Gabe.
I think that, one thing that I know we all agree on, and Jay, I agree that CrossFit really revolutionized this, is the fact that like effort and like training hard is at the crux of like getting results. And I think what CrossFit changed was a lot of people before were maybe doing strength and conditioning, and that looked like, some easy work on the elliptical or the Stairmaster followed by some easy work on some cable machines, relatively easy. I mean, and if the intensity is never there, then you're kind of spinning your wheels regardless. I think that
I'm a simp for effort. Like, and I should also add, like, I'm not as big of a fan of zone 2 as some people might assume. Like, I think for a lot of people, like if you're a professional endurance athlete or high level endurance athlete training 20 hours a week, you have to do like zone 1, 2, like easy work, just because the volume is so high, you can't sustain a higher effort. Like to get in that level of volume, a lot of it has to be easy. But if I was training a CrossFitter and I wanted to work on their aerobic capacity and get them a little bit more aerobic volume, I'm probably going to push them a little bit harder than that. I'm not going to say just like go sit at 60% heart rate on the bike, especially if they don't have a ton of time to work with, and be like, let's try to squeeze a little bit more out. Let's give a little bit more effort than that. You know what I mean?
Are you still getting benefits to your aerobic capacity if you're going out? Because one thing that I've heard is, and I'm sure this is an oversimplified explanation of it, that like, once you are over zone 2, and we can go into like, whether, a heart rate is accurate or kind of what that looks like. But once you go over a threshold, you're no longer training your aerobic capacity anymore. You're kind of training a different system. Is that how that works? Or is that just like an oversimplified way of looking at it?
I think it's an oversimplified way of looking at it. It's not really a switch that goes on and off. You're not turning off your aerobic system or anything like that. You're just limiting the amount of volume that you're going to be able to accumulate. And from a low intensity kind of aerobic adaptation perspective, when we look at improving cardiac output, when we look at improving mitochondrial volume and density, the correlation between those outcomes and just total training volume is extremely strong in terms of total aerobic training volume. The relationship with intensity is almost not, I don't want to say non-existent, but it's pretty weak. Whereas we've seen in terms of workload compared to lactate threshold, you can train at 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, anywhere from about 50 to 90% of lactate threshold when volume equated is going to drive virtually the same adaptation in terms of some of those adaptations commonly associated with low intensity work, the cardiac output improvements over time, the mitochondrial volume and density. There are adaptations specific to intensity that you have to work beyond lactate threshold for, you have to work harder for. But there's not like it's not like, oh, your heart rate went 2 beats too high, your aerobic adaptations are dead. It's like, no, you're starting to bring in a little bit more, anaerobic activity. Your recovery might be compromised a little bit. You're not going to be able to go as long and accumulate as much volume, but the underlying adaptations are still happening. It's just kind of a cost benefit analysis with the recovery. All else being equal, pushing a little bit harder on zone 2 work is going to give you more adaptation. What you have to account for is it's also going to be harder to recover from. So what's the cost of that? But again, if you're not trying to accumulate 20 hours a week, you probably don't have to slow down and be as conservative as someone who's only training for 2 or 3 hours a week. I don't think that person has to be as concerned about, oh no, I went to 80% instead of 75%. I think they're going to be just fine and probably actually benefit a little bit more, assuming recovery's in place. My kind of gold standard is always evaluate recovery and evaluate performance at your high intensity sessions. If you notice that as you start to push your easy work a little bit harder, you notice that your recovery is going downhill and your high intensity performance is going downhill, you should probably back off a little bit. But if you're feeling good and high intensity performance is preserved and you want to try to increase your zone 2 work from 70%, 75%, give it a whirl and see how it goes. And like the only way to really understand and get that intensity dialed in perfectly for you is kind of that fuck around and find out mentality of see what intensity is going to be sustainable and recoverable for you. And it can vary a lot depending on a ton of individual factors, from training volume to fitness level and absolute level of output, all those sorts of things. There's no one way to say this is the right intensity for you.
When you're working with and prescribing clients there, how are you prescribing the effort you're trying to see on any given day? Are you using RPE? Are you using heart rate? Like what does that look like?
Sometimes it depends on the person and the strategy that we're implementing. Polarized training is kind of all the rage these days, which is a lot of like low intensity zone 2 work. And then when it's time to go hard, you go really hard. So it's either like, it's a combination of a little bit of really hard training with a lot of low intensity base work.
Do you call that polarized training?
Polarized training, yeah. That's kind of the most popular kind of endurance training model or approach these days. Is, you might have heard of like the 80-20 approach, like 80% of your work should be very easy, 20% of your work should be really hard. That's kind of the polarized training model. But there's other approaches. There's also what we call sweet spot training. There's what we call pyramidal training. There's other styles of training that will use a little bit more moderate intensity work, for example. So there's no one size fits all approach to even distribution of low, medium, and high intensity work. That can vary too. And I find for a lot of people who are training a little bit less than your average endurance pro, some of those other models like sweet spot and pyramidal, where they're getting a little bit more moderate intensity work, can also work really, really well. Generally, from a prescription perspective, when I'm programming high intensity work, I almost always default to RPE. So if someone's running 800 meter repeats or 1,000 meter repeats, 400s, whatever, I'm just going to tell them I want that in an 8 out of 10 effort or 9 out of 10 effort or something like that. Or I'll describe in slightly longer form, like, this is what I want the effort to feel like. I want you to be able to maintain a consistent pace across all 8 reps, but be, pretty gassed by the end of it, et cetera. Like, I may describe it a little bit more, but it's very RPE driven. If someone is training for an event and we know kind of race paces, I may also prescribe based off of race pace. So like, I want 10 by 800 at 5K race pace, adjust up or down from there to reach RPE 8 by the end of the workout. So that might be how I prescribe a high intensity session. For low intensity sessions, it can vary a little bit more depending on the athlete and kind of their psychology. But I'm more likely to use a combination of RPE with like a heart rate cap. So I'll say easy, like just go easy, whatever that means for you. But I don't want to see your heart rate go over 150 on this session, for example. And that cap could vary, situation to situation. And we can get that dialed in over time. And I may modify that cap based on how they respond to the training. So maybe I say, easy, whatever that means for you today, but absolute cap of 150. And if I notice that they're consistently hitting that cap, they're hitting 150, and I notice their high intensity sessions are declining, they're not recovering very well, I may say, hey, I think we need to pull back your low intensity cap to 145 and see how that goes for a little while. So that can, ebb and flow over time depending on training volume, what we're doing in the high intensity side, that kind of thing. But that's generally how I use like RPE, pace, and heart rate kind of prescriptively across a range of different workout types.
On that note, I'm curious. We have a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot, but a decent amount of people that email in, because we offer training programs, and both of our main training programs are 5 training days a week. They can be done, I would say, within like 60 minutes tops, maybe a little bit more if you're not like really on top of it. But for someone that says 3 days, that's all I got, 3 days, and like has to be less than 40 minutes, like ideally 30 minutes. What are you giving someone for like general being a capable human being, improving their body composition a little bit, like hitting all the bases? They got 3 days and 30 to 40 minutes.
Great. So there's a number of ways you could divide the work across the week, but I generally want to see someone training each muscle group at least twice a week. If I have 3 days to work with, I'll either do 2 full body sessions and a session that's more cardio focused, or I'll divide that across all 3 sessions. So all 3 sessions are full body with a little bit of cardio. I generally, especially if it's only 3 days a week and very limited time, I'm going to spend the vast majority of that on strength training, and then a small portion of that on high intensity cardio, getting as much bang for the buck as we can with just a couple hard intervals. So for example, on a full body session, I might just run through a squat, hinge, push and pull, 1 to 2 working sets each for those movement patterns, and then get someone into 5-minute cardio warm up. Give me 4 60-second all out efforts with generous recovery. I think he can knock out a session like that in well under an hour and get a ton of benefit from that. If you repeat variations of that a couple days a week, so the second day, maybe we pick slightly different movements for your push and pull. Maybe instead of a bench press in a row, we're going to overhead press and a pull down. For the cardio, instead of 60-second intervals, I just want you to give me like one long 10-minute moderate effort piece. I think you can get a ton of benefit from that without spending more than 30 minutes in the strength and 10 to 15 minutes in the cardio. 3 days a week of that, if the effort is there, if you know how to do a couple warm-up feeder sets, you know how to push close to failure. I think if you just do one working set very, very hard, good range of motion, good effort on a squat, hinge, push, pull, tremendous results from that. We can always add on, but that's a fantastic start. And I think that alone is going to get someone at least halfway there, if not 60, 70%.